the ancient supernatural knowledge of the ancient Greek mystics and their mysteries. The first indications of the practice of shamanism in Greece go back to times around 1500 to 2000 BC in Thrace, Scythia, and in general the north-central Asia area. Also the myth of Avaris, similar to the Greek Amberborean, the Hyperborean Apollo, advocates this. However, the evidence is few and goes back to the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the centuries with the most basic evidence being the written poetic the texts of Empedocles. Myths and legends and practices in later literature also argue for the existence of shamanism long before. The main features of this practice are summarized as follows. 1. Belief in transmigration. 2. Belief in the existence of soul and guiding spirits. For example, Epimenides was a metamorphosis of Achaeus Pythagoras of Hermotomis. 3. The establishment of religious groups, Croton of Sicily, where disciples practiced seclusion, silence, fasting, and psychic and metaphysical abilities, including even transfiguration into other animals and human forms. The key element of shamanistic culture is a belief that there is a soul which is actually more active than the body is asleep, or as Aristotle says, when it is at the point of death. This belief has left traces in a large area that stretches in a great arc from Scandinavia along the Eurasian space to Indonesia. Thus, in Thrace, northern Greece, and Scythia, the Greeks had come into contact with people who were related to shamanism even in the archaic era, with the appearance of medical diviners who were diviners, healers, and religious teachers with shamanistic characteristics. It's said that these soothsayers were also tattooed with shamanistic symbols. Also, Baki healing, as we will see coming later on, as shamanistic roots. Nevertheless, all the peoples of the Mediterranean were not indifferent to beliefs like these and passed through the stage of animistic worship, that worship of nymphs, worship of the earth, heaven, moons, and stars. There was also the cult of dead ancestors, which was denominated by the view that the underworld consisted of spirit guides to whom we could turn when we needed advice. So we see how old the concept of resurrection and spiritual mutation is, and how deeply rooted belief in spirits has been throughout the ages. The few Greek mythical figures who can be compared to shamans claim descent from Apollo, and it is estimated that they arrived in Greece from the north, from the country of Hyperboreans, which is also the original homeland of Apollo. And the ancient Greeks said that the Hyperboreans, of course, were Atlanteans and extraterrestrials. Now, beyond the north, they said, came the weightless rider on an arrow, as it seems to still be the case with souls in Siberia. He was so advanced in the art of fasting that he had learned to live without any human food. He eradicated plagues, predicted earthquakes, composed religious poems, and taught the worship of his northern god, whom the Greeks called the super-northern Apollo. A later myth shows us Avaris flying through the ether on his arrow. Many they claim that this arrow was actually a spacecraft. Now, the arrow that plays a role in Scythian mythology and religion is a symbol of magical flight, quote unquote. The shamans used the arrow to bring back the souls of the sick, and also at funerals, shamans also divine by the flight of the arrow. Aristeas, the Proconisius, was also related to Apollo. He falls into a trance and the god grabs his soul, quote unquote. He happens to appear at the same time in places far from each other. It connects Apollo in the form of a raven, which makes us think of shamanistic transformations. Hermotimus Clazomenon had the power to leave his body, quote, for many years, end quote. During this long trance, he traveled far and, quote, brought prophetic knowledge of the future, end quote. His enemies burned his body and his soul never returned. This trance has all the characteristic of shamanic terror. Epimenides, who came from Knossos palace of Heraclean Crete, claimed to have lived before and to be identical with Aeacus, an ancient divine man, and has been likened to the northern shaman type. He himself also had experience of psychic wanderings, and like Avarice, he was a great faster, living exclusively on a preparation of vegetables, which he used to store, for reasons he himself knew very well, in the hoof of an ox, of all places. Another notable feature of his tradition is that after his death, people saw his body covered with tattoos. As for the long sleep, this is of course a widespread folktale. However, the position of sleep at the beginning of Epimenides' story suggests that the Greeks had in mind the long-term retreat, which is a shaman's apprenticeship, who sometimes spends a large part of it in a state of sleep and slumber. And finally, Orpheus, whose homeland is Thrace, and therein Thrace accompanies a god that the Greeks identified with Apollo. He combines the professions of poet, magician, religious teacher, and financier. Like some mythical shamans of Siberia, he can, with his magic, gather birds and wild animals to listen to him. As shamans do everywhere, he visits the underworld, and his motive is very common for shamans: to win back a stolen soul. Ultimately, his magical ego survives as an odic head, which continues to give oracles many years after his death. Orpheus is also a figure very similar to Zalmoxis, a mythical shaman or archetype of shamans. Empedocles in Sicily, on whom our knowledge of early Greek shamanism is mainly based, and Pythagoras were, however, the greatest shamans in the Greek area. Empedocles lived in Agrigenta, Sicily, in the 5th century BC, and was one of the most legendary figures in the field of pre-Socratic philosophers. His life is full of occult stories and miracles that border on myth. In his person, the Agrigentis saw not only a great philosopher, but also a worthy politician, physician, diviner, magician, and poet. The Oyendis Laertis, in his 8th book, relates a series of legendary stories about the death of Empedocles. Quote, "Several things are being said about his death. Heraclides, who mentioned the woman who did not breathe, that Empedocles was glorified when he sent the young women back alive, says that he offered a sacrifice in the field of Pausanias. He had also invited some of his friends, including Pausanias. After the feast, the rest withdrew and rested, some under trees in the neighboring field, and others wherever they pleased. Empedocles remained where he had been sitting. When they got up in the morning, he was the only one missing. They began to look for him, and the slaves who were questioned said that they knew nothing. One then said that at midnight he had heard a very loud voice calling Empedocles, and that after that he got up and saw a heavenly light and a flash. Hermippus says that he cured a certain Agrigentine Panthea who had been written off by doctors, and for that he made the sacrifice, and that those whom he had summoned were about 80. Hippobotus states that when he got up, he proceeded towards Etna, and as soon as he arrived, he approached the craters of fire and disappeared, wanting in this way to strengthen the rumor that he had become a god." End quote. Empedocles, with his philosophy, seeks the real knowledge and essence of nature, which is characterized by an eternal change. This interchange lies between the change of Heraclitus becoming and the constancy of Parmenides being. Empedocles stands between these two philosophical positions and defines as a primary cause of the birth of all beings the movement of 4 primary elements, which he calls rhizomes. The elements: 1, fire is Zeus; 2, water is Mystis; 3, earth is Adoneus or Hades; and 4, air is Hera. The movement of these elements is due to 2 opposing forces, which he calls friendship and nikos. Friendship is the positive force of love that unites things, and nikos is a negative force that separates them. The relationship of these countervailing forces is what maintains the balance in the universe, the sphere. Birth and death, friendship and nakos are for Empedocles an eternal cycle, an alteration that ensures the perpetuation of the world. Empedocles' work consists of 2 hexameter poems on nature, 2,000 verses, and on the purifications, 3,000 verses. Empedocles' epic verses have a tremendous dynamic that creates a series of thoughts or analyses for the reader or scholar. So this fact led many later philosophers, such as Aristotle and Plato, to deal with the positions of Empedocles in their work, and thus saved many passages of the great philosopher to this day. Pythagoras claimed to be identified with Hermotimos, and like his predecessor Herodotus, Thrace, and Salmonics, he established a kind of religious order, a community of men and women whose rule of life was determined by the expectation of the life to come. In essence, there is probably no clearer distinction between Orphic teaching and Pythagoreanism. As in Siberian shamanism, the experience of past lives is not a source of guilt but of strength. Also, a concept of purification was a very basic occupation of religious spirits during the archaic era itself. Pythagoras, after his studies, was mature, possessed of extraordinary beauty, peaceful, with special grace, genius, and willpower. Practicing virtue throughout his life, he perfected himself to such an extent that he became a superman and a great mystic, acquiring powers of insight and healing and a radiant will, which gave him truly miraculous powers. Thus he was known everywhere, affecting healing the sick and providing for a future, having as his mission the reformation of all mankind. In fact, he arrived at the view of monotheism through his philosophical system, although this was never directly investigated due to the climate of the time. However, it's considered that he laid the philosophical foundations for the later appearance of monotheism. Since there are no written books by him, we derive information about his work from one of the surviving passages of the various Pythagoreans, who after the death of Pythagoras wrote various works, and in particular by Epicharmus, Philolaus, Lycidas, Cleinias, and Archytas and company. On the other hand, from the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and the Life of Pythagoras, written by Diogenes in the 4th century AD, by Porphyry at the same century, and by Iambicus, student of Porphyry. Finally, Empedocles, the philosopher's last student, wrote about Pythagoras, saying, quote, "There was among the Greeks a man endowed with infinite wisdom, whose intellect encompassed a priceless treasure of thoughts. He shines in the most different sciences, and when he was researching a subject, his genius was beyond lightning. His sharp gaze in a short time discovered more truth than 10 or 20 human generations could discover." End quote. Finally, the greatest goods, Socrates tells Phaedrus, come to us through rage, Plato adds, and on the condition that the rage is given by a divine gift, and distinguishes 4 types. 1. The prophetic rage with the patron god Apollo. 2. The operative or ritual mania with the god Dionysius as patron. 3. The poetic mania inspired by the muses. 4. The love frenzy inspired by Aphrodite and Eros. In ancient Greece, the original forms of healing stem from sacred rituals. The mythical centaurs were famous teachers of the heroes who, among other things, had knowledge of medicine in their caves, and they taught martial arts, dance, and medicine. In fact, they said that these creatures knew how to measure the wind, hence their name. They were the first healing deities of the Greeks. Later, Asclepia and folk healing, divination, herbalism, and early shamanic healing are based on the archetype of the sacred healer, most notably the god Apollo. Asclepius was considered a demigod, the son of Apollo, and thereafter a healer, and he founded the well-known Asclepia in many regions of Greece that had many and strong shamanistic elements. Special mention is made of the method that prevailed, hence the incarnation in which God appeared to the patient and gave instructions about his treatment and his subsequent living, change of mentality with an obvious moralistic goal. The Bacchic healing and worldview originates from indigenous populations of the Eastern Aegean around the 2nd millennium BC. According to that, the patients showed the holy mania, hence with dance, music, or even physical exertion, they entered another expanded dimension of understanding from where, when they came out, they showed a pacification and a new identity again based on the moralistic perception. Representatives of this method were Savalius of Thrace and Attis in Asia Minor. The method also returned during the Peloponnesian War. Later, we see remnants of this method taking over Christianity as well, where pilgrims and monks in a maniacal state tortured themselves. Shamans, however, in contrast, are always seized by holy rage only to heal, and they believe that our spirits need us as much as we need them, because without a healthy and strong body, they cannot be useful in society. The first disengagement from liturgies was done in ancient Greece by Hippocrates, 360 to 470 BC. The first step towards scientific medicine, based on the secular guide, The Guild of Healers, is being made. He wrote about 70 treatises, although it seems that not all of them are his. In Kos, where he had established a medical center with an existing library. To Hippocrates, we owe the concept of method. Hence, the successive steps for monitoring and developing the disease and its symptoms, a clear distinction is made between the two. It does not deal with the classification of diseases. They are simply classified into acute and chronic, and endemic and epidemic. First, he deals with the patient's reactions and environmental correlations. It was mainly conservative operations with few drugs and surgical operations. He believed in the self-healing power of nature that had to be taken into account. This perception, of course, is very different from Descartes and today's practices. His view was that the physician should anticipate and prevent, hence he had a preventive environmental orientation. Medicine is a disturbance of the balance of man and the environment, where the disease develops in between them. According to Hippocrates, medicine also has a political character since, as he says, oligarchic regimes are more morbid since they cause fear and therefore disease. It's very similar to the concepts of modern homeopathy. And this I've translated for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.